C.D. Martha Richardson usually required 6 months to finish. Upon completion, new members had been mentally transformed into obedient followers who considered questioning the family's power equivalent to questioning God's authority. The community's daily schedule reinforced this control constantly. Members awakened at 4:30 each morning to Brother Caleb's bell, consumed breakfast prepared under Hannah Collins's direction, and spent their days at designated duties that had been carefully designed to prevent private discussions or independent thought. Evening religious services, conducted by Samuel Richardson, with various family members in supporting roles, mixed genuine spiritual components with subtle mental manipulation that strengthened dependence and discouraged analytical thinking. The first break in Pleasant Hill's flawless appearance occurred on a bitter February morning in 1812, when Brother Thomas Whitman, a prosperous merchant who had contributed his complete fortune to the community 5 years before, started raising troubling questions about the community's financial matters during a public gathering. Brother Thomas had joined Pleasant Hill in 1807 as one of the settlement's earliest and most generous converts, a widower in his 50s whose children had perished in a cholera epidemic. He had discovered solace in the Shaker, promise of spiritual family and eternal meaning. His contribution of a flourishing dry goods enterprise and considerable property holdings had supplied much of the funding that enabled the Richardson family to establish their activities on such an impressive scale. For 5 years, Thomas had been the ideal community member. He labored tirelessly in Brother Ezekiel's farming operations, served as a guide to younger converts, and never challenged the leadership's choices. His evolution from successful businessman to humble Shaker brother impressed visitors and strengthened the community's reputation for spiritual genuineness. However, Thomas's business experience made him uniquely qualified to spot irregularities that escaped other members' notice. His practiced eye for financial details, combined with his access to certain operational documents through his agricultural duties, gradually exposed inconsistencies that troubled his conscience. The seed business income reported by Brother Isaiah didn't correspond with the amounts Thomas had witnessed during his visits to customer farms. The furniture workshop earnings appeared impossibly high considering the number of pieces he observed being manufactured. Most puzzling, the community's membership figures didn't match the consumption records he kept for feed and supplies. Brothers and sisters, Thomas declared during the monthly community assembly, his weathered hands holding several pages of carefully computed figures. I've been praying about some concerns that burden my heart heavily. Our blessed community has flourished beyond measure. Yet I observe contradictions in our documentation that disturb my spirit. The quiet that ensued was overwhelming throughout the crowded meeting hall. Richardson family members shared looks that lasted only moments but conveyed volumes. Samuel Richardson's expression stayed calm, his hands folded peacefully in his lap, but those familiar with him noticed a slight tension around his eyes. Sister Martha's gentle smile never faltered, yet her knuckles grew white as she gripped her prayer book with mounting tension. The seed enterprise, Thomas continued, his voice strengthening as he warmed to his subject. Brother Isaiah documented earnings of $800 from Ohio clients last quarter, but when I transported supplies to those identical farms, I calculated sales that should have produced nearly $1,200. Where has this missing revenue gone? Brother Caleb Richardson rose from his position near the entrance, supposedly to adjust the room's temperature, but his movement placed him between Thomas and the doorway. Sister Rebecca's gaze never left Thomas's face, cataloging every expression and movement for subsequent analysis. Throughout the room, other Richardson family members made subtle adjustments to their positions, forming an almost invisible web of observation and control. Furthermore, Thomas pressed forward, apparently unaware of the dangerous ground he was entering. Our membership records indicate 400 souls, yet our food consumption suggests we're feeding barely 250. Brother Jeremiah's furniture workshops claim to employ 50 members, but I count only 37 who regularly appear for that work. These numbers don't balance, and as guardians of God's abundance, shouldn't we demand precision in our bookkeeping? The response came not from Samuel but from Mother Sarah Richardson, whose elderly voice carried surprising power across the silent hall. Brother Thomas, she said, her tone blending gentle correction with unmistakable warning, your concerns reveal a heart still bound to worldly thinking. In our blessed community, we trust that our leaders, guided by divine wisdom, handle all temporal matters for our spiritual benefit. Perhaps you need time for prayer and contemplation to overcome these doubts that trouble your faith. Samuel Richardson nodded solemnly, his expression radiating fatherly concern for a wayward child. "Brother Thomas, your dedication to our community's welfare moves my heart deeply. But perhaps your mind has been clouded by memories of your former worldly existence. Sister Hannah, would you prepare Brother Thomas some of your special chamomile tea? I believe he needs rest and reflection to clear his thoughts of these troubling concerns." The meeting continued for another hour, but Thomas Whitman's questions had fundamentally changed the atmosphere. Other members avoided eye contact with him, suddenly finding urgent reasons to examine their prayer books or adjust their clothing. The Richardson family's responses to subsequent business matters carried an underlying tension that hadn't existed before Thomas's intervention that evening. Thomas was discovered dead in his dormitory bed by Sister Rebecca, who found the body during her routine evening inspection of the men's quarters. Her tearful announcement to the assembled community painted a picture of peaceful passing. Brother Thomas passed gently in his sleep, called home by the Lord after confessing his sin of doubt during evening prayers. His final words were an apology for allowing worldly concerns to cloud his spiritual vision. The community accepted this explanation with the resigned faith they'd been conditioned to embrace. After all, questioning the leadership's account of events was equivalent to questioning God's will. Brother Thomas's funeral the following day became a lesson about the dangers of allowing business concerns to interfere with spiritual submission. But young Sister Mary Caldwell, who cleaned the dormitories each morning, noticed details that would haunt her for decades. When she entered Thomas's room to prepare it for cleaning, she was struck by the bitter almond odor that lingered despite the room's windows being open all night. Thomas's fingernails had turned a distinct blue color that she'd never seen on any corpse, including her own grandfather who had died peacefully. At home, most disturbing of all, she discovered traces of white foam around Thomas's mouth that Sister Rebecca had carefully wiped away before calling for help. Mary watched in growing horror as Brother Caleb Richardson collected all of Thomas's personal papers, including the financial calculations that had started the crisis. These documents, along with Thomas's ledger books and correspondence, were burned in the communal fireplace that very night during what Samuel Richardson described as a cleansing ceremony to purge worldly attachments from our sacred space. The community's reaction revealed how thoroughly the Richardsons controlled information flow and emotional responses. Within hours of Thomas's death, Sister Martha was leading prayer circles where members confessed their own doubts and worldly thoughts, creating an atmosphere where questioning leadership became synonymous with spiritual failure. Brother Ezekiel organized intensive work details that kept potential questioners busy from dawn to dusk, leaving no time for private conversations or independent reflection. Brother Jeremiah led evening discussions about the dangers of challenging spiritual authority, using Thomas as a cautionary tale of what happened when faith wavered and worldly concerns corrupted pure hearts. These sessions, which became a regular feature of community life, served the dual purpose of preventing future dissent while identifying members whose responses suggested they might harbor similar doubts. The most chilling aspect of the community's response was how quickly Thomas Whitman's memory was erased. His personal belongings were redistributed within days, his work assignments transferred to other members, and his name removed from community records except for a brief death notice. Within a month, it was as if Brother Thomas had never existed, and all his questions forgotten and his concerns dismissed, as the ravings of a mind corrupted by worldly attachment. In the months following Thomas Whitman's death, a pattern began to emerge that would continue for over 2 decades. Growing more sophisticated and ruthless with each iteration, members who asked probing questions about finances, who expressed desire to visit family outside the community, or who showed signs of wanting to leave Pleasant Hill, began experiencing what the Richardsons termed spiritual crisis requiring special intervention. Brother Jeremiah Richardson developed what became known as the retreat system for handling dissent. When someone questioned community practices or showed signs of independence, they would be assigned to special prayer and fasting retreats in isolated cabins scattered across the community's extensive property. These retreats, always supervised by various Richardson family members, were presented as opportunities for troubled souls to reconnect with divine purpose through solitude and meditation. The retreat cabins, constructed under Brother Jeremiah's direction in remote corners of the community's thousands of acres, were designed to appear rustic and spiritual while serving their true purpose as holding facilities. Each cabin contained a single room with basic furniture, heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from outside, and doors that locked only from the exterior. The cabin's isolated locations, connected to the main community only by narrow paths through dense woods, ensured that any sounds from within would never reach other members. Brother Caleb Richardson managed the logistics of identifying retreat candidates. His network of informants throughout the community reported private conversations, observed relationships, and monitored correspondence for signs of disloyalty or independent thinking. His methods were so subtle that most members never realized they were being watched, attributing chance encounters with Caleb to coincidence rather than systematic surveillance. The selection process for retreats followed carefully developed criteria. Recent converts who asked too many questions about absent family members were prime candidates, as were longer-term members who showed signs of developing leadership potential that might threaten Richardson authority. Members who demonstrated excessive attachment to possessions they had donated, who expressed homesickness during community meetings, or who formed close friendships that might enable organized resistance also found themselves selected for spiritual intervention. Sister Hannah Collins managed the community's correspondence with remarkable sophistication, ensuring that worried family members received carefully crafted letters explaining their loved ones' sudden departures or deaths. Her penmanship was flawless, and she had studied each member's writing style with scientific precision, enabling her to forge convincing final letters that would satisfy distant relatives for years to come. Hannah's forgery operation required extensive preparation and planning. She maintained detailed files on each community member's background, including samples of their handwriting, information about distant relatives, and knowledge of their precon lives that could be referenced in false correspondence. When someone was selected for elimination, Hannah would prepare multiple letters to be sent over several months, creating the illusion of an ongoing correspondence that gradually explained the person's absence. Parents in Ohio received touching notes from children they would never see again, describing spiritual revelations that called them to missionary work in untamed Western territories. Siblings in Pennsylvania got detailed accounts of peaceful deaths following brief illnesses, complete with descriptions of final words and burial ceremonies that never occurred. The letters were masterpieces of emotional manipulation, designed to provide closure while discouraging further inquiry. Brother Isaiah Richardson's seed business provided perfect cover for disposing of evidence and maintaining the community's external relationships. His monthly trips to distant farms offered opportunities to bury bodies in remote locations across Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee while simultaneously conducting legitimate business that reinforced his reputation as a trustworthy merchant and devout Shaker brother. Isaiah's routes were carefully planned to serve multiple purposes. His legitimate customers provided alibis for his presence in distant locations, while his knowledge of remote farm properties, gained through years of business relationships, enabled him to identify burial sites that would never be discovered. He developed relationships with isolated farmers who welcomed his visits and never questioned his occasional requests to camp overnight on their property during bad weather. The disposal process was methodical and efficient. Bodies were transported in specially modified seed wagons that appeared to contain normal agricultural supplies but included hidden compartments designed for their grisly cargo. Isaiah's reputation for punctuality and reliability meant that his overnight absences during trips were never questioned by customers who assumed he was maintaining his demanding schedule. Local authorities, when they occasionally inquired about missing persons, were shown immaculate records maintained by Sister Patience Richardson. Her documentation system was a marvel of bureaucratic deception, demonstrating through carefully crafted paperwork that individuals had left voluntarily for other communities or had died of natural causes with proper burial in the community cemetery. Patience's record-keeping extended far beyond simple membership logs. She maintained detailed medical histories that could explain sudden deaths from natural causes, travel documentation that supported claims about members departing for distant communities, and correspondence files that included both genuine letters and Hannah's forgeries. Her organizational skills ensured that any official inquiry could be answered with convincing documentation that withstood casual scrutiny. The psychological control the Richardson family maintained was perhaps more chilling than their physical crimes. They had created a closed system where questioning authority was equated with spiritual failure, where blind obedience was the highest virtue, and where members policed each other's thoughts and behaviors. The remaining community members weren't just victims, they had been transformed into unwitting accomplices in their own oppression. The community's population remained steady at around 400 members despite the constant stream of new converts arriving monthly, and the mysterious disappearances that occurred with increasing frequency. This stability was maintained through what Brother Caleb privately called natural selection, the systematic removal of anyone who posed a threat to family control, balanced by aggressive recruitment of new converts whose property donations financed the operation's expansion. New arrivals were carefully screened by the Richardson women, who had developed sophisticated methods for identifying potential troublemakers before they could influence other members. Sister Rebecca's intake interviews, conducted under the guise of spiritual counseling, actually served to assess each convert's psychological profile, family connections, and potential value to the community. Those deemed dangerous were marked for early elimination, while valuable converts underwent intensive indoctrination designed to strip away their previous identities. The indoctrination process, refined over years of practice, combined genuine spiritual elements with systematic psychological abuse that created trauma bonds between victims and their abusers. New converts were isolated from contact with the outside world while being subjected to alternating periods of intense attention and deliberate neglect that broke down their psychological defenses and made them desperate for approval from community leaders. By 1825, Pleasant Hill operated like a well-oiled machine of exploitation, its various components working together with mechanical precision that would have impressed any efficiency expert. The Richardson family had refined their methods over 18 years of practice, transforming what had begun as opportunistic crimes into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated enormous profits while maintaining an impeccable public reputation. The family's division of labor had evolved into a complex organizational structure that maximized efficiency while minimizing risk. Samuel Richardson maintained his role as spiritual leader and public face of the community, delivering inspiring sermons that drew new converts regularly while keeping existing members focused on heavenly rewards rather than earthly concerns. His charismatic presence had become legendary throughout Kentucky's religious communities, with ministers from other denominations frequently citing Pleasant Hill as an example of successful Christian living. Martha Richardson had developed what amounted to a science of psychological manipulation, studying each community member with the intensity of a naturalist observing specimens. Her methods for breaking down individual resistance and rebuilding personalities according to family specifications had become so refined that the process typically took only 3 to 4 months to complete. She maintained detailed psychological profiles on every member, updating them regularly based on observations from her network of female relatives and informants. The community's expansion had enabled more sophisticated criminal operations that generated multiple revenue streams. Brother Ezekiel Richardson's agricultural operations now supplied produce to markets in Louisville, Lexington, and Cincinnati, generating enormous profits that never appeared in the books shown to members. His workforce of unpaid community members, maintained through psychological coercion rather than physical restraint, provided labor costs that made Pleasant Hill farms impossibly profitable compared to conventional operations. Brother Jeremiah Richardson's furniture workshops had similarly expanded, producing pieces that were sold throughout the Ohio River Valley and marketed as authentic Shaker craftsmanship. The quality remained high because Jeremiah genuinely understood woodworking, but the labor was essentially slavery disguised as religious devotion. His workers put in 12 to 14-hour days producing furniture that sold for premium prices, with profits flowing entirely to the Richardson family's private accounts. The most insidious development was how the family had begun selling community members to buyers who operated plantations and industrial facilities throughout the South and Midwest. This human trafficking operation, coordinated primarily by Brother Isaiah during his seed business travels, provided the highest profit margins of any family enterprise while explaining the mysterious disappearances that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention. The selection process for trafficking victims followed coldly calculated criteria. Members with valuable skills but dangerous independent tendencies were prime candidates, as were individuals whose family connections made their continued presence at Pleasant Hill potentially problematic. The buyers, who believed they were purchasing indentured servants rather than free citizens, paid substantial sums for workers who came with fabricated documentation proving their voluntary servitude. Sister Rebecca Richardson had become the family's specialist in breaking down new converts and identifying those suitable for different fates. Her psychological assessment, process, disguised as spiritual counseling, enabled her to categorize newcomers into groups: valuable long-term assets who would remain at Pleasant Hill, potential trafficking victims who could be sold for profit, and dangerous individuals who needed immediate elimination. Rebecca's methods combined genuine spiritual guidance with systematic abuse that created powerful trauma bonds between victims and their abusers. She had studied the conversion experiences of legitimate Shaker communities, then perverted these techniques to serve the family's criminal purposes. Her sessions left converts psychologically dependent on her approval while stripping away their connections to previous identities and relationships. The community's isolation had become both geographical and psychological, with members existing in a closed information environment where the Richardson family controlled every source of knowledge and interpretation. Located on thousands of acres of family-controlled land, members rarely encountered outsiders except during carefully supervised visits to nearby towns. Even these excursions were managed by Richardson family members who monitored all interactions and reported any conversations that suggested disloyalty. Family had cultivated extensive relationships with local authorities that provided protection from official scrutiny. Sheriff William Morrison of Mercer County had become essentially a paid ally, receiving regular donations to his campaign funds and personal accounts in exchange for his assumption that Pleasant Hill was a model religious community deserving protection rather than investigation. These relationships extended throughout the region's power structure. Brother Nathan Richardson's charm offensive had won allies among local merchants, politicians, and religious leaders who viewed Pleasant Hill as a valuable economic and spiritual asset to their communities. The community's legitimate business operations provided substantial tax revenue and employment opportunities that made local officials reluctant to investigate rumors or complaints. The psychological control mechanisms had evolved to include elaborate rituals and ceremonies that reinforced member dependency while identifying potential dissidents. Samuel Richardson's worship services combined authentic Shaker elements with subtle psychological manipulation that created altered states of consciousness where critical thinking became impossible. These services often lasted for hours, leaving participants emotionally drained and psychologically vulnerable to suggestion. Evening confession sessions, led by various Richardson family members, served multiple purposes beyond spiritual guidance. They provided opportunities to identify members harboring doubts or resentments, created public pressure for conformity through shame and guilt, and enabled the family to gather intelligence about private conversations and relationships that might threaten their control. The confession process had become increasingly elaborate, with different family members specializing in extracting specific types of information. Sister Rebecca focused on relationships and emotional attachments that might enable resistance, while Brother Caleb concentrated on practical concerns like escape plans or contact with outside authorities. Sister Hannah monitored confessions for information about family members outside the community who might become problematic if they began asking questions. Mother Sarah Richardson, despite her apparent frailty, had emerged as the family's strategic mastermind, whose decades of experience in manipulation guided their long-term planning. Her ability to appear harmless while orchestrating complex criminal operations had become legendary among family members, who referred to her privately as the General. In recognition of her tactical brilliance, Sarah's influence extended to every aspect of the operation. From the selection of new territories for expansion to the development of new techniques for psychological control, her understanding of human nature, gained through 70 years of observing and manipulating others, enabled her to predict how individuals would respond to various pressures and rewards. Her strategic vision had transformed the family's criminal enterprise from opportunistic theft into a sustainable business model that could theoretically continue indefinitely. The expansion of their operations had required increasingly sophisticated methods for maintaining security and preventing exposure. The family had developed elaborate communication systems that enabled coordination across their various enterprises while minimizing the risk of interception by hostile parties. They used coded language in their correspondence, maintained separate financial accounts for different operations, and created false identities that could be used if rapid escape became necessary. The beginning of the end for the Richardson family's 27-year reign of terror came from an unexpected source. Their own success had attracted attention from the legitimate Shaker leadership in Ohio. In late 1833, the Ohio Union of Shaker Communities decided to send Elder Joseph Meacham, one of their most experienced and respected leaders, to evaluate Pleasant Hill for potential inclusion in their formal alliance of authenticated Shaker settlements. Elder Meacham was not the typical visitor the Richardsons were accustomed to. A genuine disciple of Mother Ann Lee's teachings who had spent 40 years in Shaker communities across New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, he possessed an intimate knowledge of proper Shaker practices, record-keeping, and community structure that made him nearly impossible to deceive. His mission was to verify that Pleasant Hill truly followed authentic Shaker principles before recommending them for official recognition and inclusion in the Union's collective decision-making processes. The evaluation request had come after years of glowing reports about Pleasant Hill's spiritual achievements and economic success. The Ohio leadership had been impressed by accounts of the community's growth, their reputation for quality craftsmanship, and their apparent success in maintaining celibacy and communal property arrangements over more than 2 decades. The decision to send Meacham represented both an honor and a potentially devastating threat to the Richardson family's carefully constructed facade. Samuel Richardson initially welcomed the evaluation with apparent enthusiasm, confident that his family's carefully constructed facade would fool another religious leader. After all, they had successfully deceived hundreds of visitors over the years, including ministers from other denominations who had left Pleasant Hill convinced of its spiritual authenticity. The family's experience in managing inspections had given them confidence that they could control the process and manipulate conclusions, but Meacham's first requests immediately raised alarm bells throughout the Richardson network. Unlike previous visitors who were content with guided tours and carefully staged demonstrations of community life, Meacham wanted to examine financial records. Going back to the community's founding in 1807, he insisted on speaking privately with randomly selected members without Richardson family supervision or preparation. Most troubling of all, he brought his own accounting ledgers and expected to reconcile Pleasant Hill's reported membership numbers with their consumption records, work output, and correspondence logs. The scope of Meacham's investigation became clear during his first meeting with Samuel Richardson, conducted in the community's main meeting hall before an audience of senior members. Brother Samuel Meacham said in his quiet but authoritative voice, "The Ohio Union has developed standardized procedures for evaluating potential member communities. We'll need to review your membership rolls, financial records, correspondence files, and burial registers for the past 5 years. We'll also need to conduct private interviews with at least 50 members selected through random drawing." Samuel's response revealed the first crack in his usually perfect composure. "Elder Meacham, we are honored by your visit and eager to demonstrate our commitment to Mother Ann's teachings. However, our record-keeping follows Kentucky practices that may differ from Ohio standards. Perhaps we could arrange a more informal evaluation that better reflects our unique circumstances." Meacham's expression remained pleasant but firm. "I appreciate your regional considerations, Brother Samuel, but the Union standards apply equally to all communities regardless of location. Authentic Shaker practices are universal, not subject to regional variation. We'll begin with the membership rolls and burial registers tomorrow morning." That evening, the Richardson family held an emergency meeting in Samuel's private quarters. Their voices hushed but their panic evident to anyone who might have been listening. Mother Sarah Richardson, despite her apparent frailty, took charge of the strategy session with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crises. "This man knows things we can't fake," she whispered urgently. "He's asking for documentation we can't provide without exposing everything. We need to delay, deflect, and if necessary, eliminate the threat before he completes his investigation." Brother Isaiah Richardson was the first to articulate the scope of their vulnerability. "He's asking for records going back 5 years, but our problems go back much further. The membership numbers alone will expose us. Our books show 400 members, but we've got maybe 250 actually living here. The burial registers are even worse. We've got graves for people who supposedly left for other communities." Sister Hannah Collins added another terrifying dimension to their predicament. "He's already identified inconsistencies in the correspondence I've been maintaining with other communities. He knows Shaker writing conventions I never learned, and he's asking questions about Mother Lee's teachings that our people can't answer because they were never properly instructed." The family's initial attempts to delay and deflect Meacham's investigation only intensified his suspicions and strengthened his resolve to uncover the truth. When they claimed certain records were stored in a building that had been damaged by recent storms, he pointed out that none of the buildings showed signs of weather damage. When they suggested interviewing specific members who could vouch for community practices, he insisted on selecting interview subjects himself through random drawing from a complete membership list. Brother Caleb Richardson's surveillance network, so effective at monitoring community members, proved useless against an investigator who understood the importance of maintaining operational security. Meacham varied his routines, conducted interviews in different locations, and seemed to possess an intuitive awareness of when he was being watched. His questions during member interviews revealed a depth of knowledge about authentic Shaker practices that made it impossible to maintain their deceptions. Most dangerously, some of the community's surviving members began responding to Meacham's genuine spiritual presence in ways that terrified the Richardson family. Sister Mary Caldwell, who had witnessed Brother Thomas Whitman's suspicious death over 20 years earlier, found herself drawn to Meacham's obvious authenticity and began sharing her long-suppressed observations about members who had mysteriously disappeared. The psychological effect of Meacham's presence on community members was profound and immediate. For the first time in decades, they encountered someone whose spiritual authority didn't depend on fear, manipulation, or psychological abuse. His gentle questions about their experiences, his obvious knowledge of authentic Shaker practices, and his genuine concern for their spiritual welfare created an atmosphere where long-buried doubts and memories began to surface. Brother Jeremiah Richardson, whose furniture workshops provided crucial income for the family's operations, found his workers becoming increasingly unproductive as they spent time talking with Meacham about traditional Shaker craftsmanship techniques they had never been taught. The conversations revealed gaps in their knowledge that made it obvious they weren't receiving proper instruction in authentic Shaker methods. Sister Rebecca Richardson's carefully controlled dormitory system began breaking down as female members started asking questions about Shaker practices they'd never heard of before Meacham's arrival. Her authority, so absolute for so many years, suddenly seemed questionable when compared to the obvious authenticity of their visitors' spiritual knowledge and gentle demeanor. The investigation took a decisive turn when Meacham requested access to the community cemetery for a private memorial service honoring departed members. The Richardson family couldn't refuse such a reasonable request without appearing suspicious, but they also couldn't allow him to examine the burial grounds too closely without risking exposure of their crimes. Brother Caleb volunteered to escort Meacham to the cemetery, hoping to control what he observed and limit his time among the graves. But Meacham's trained eye immediately noticed inconsistencies that had escaped casual observers for decades. The burial patterns didn't match the death dates in official records, and the condition of grave markers suggested many more interments than the documented deaths could account for. Brother Caleb, Meacham said quietly as they stood among the headstones, "I noticed some irregularities in your burial record. This grave marker indicates Brother William died in 1829, but your correspondence files show letters from him dated 1830. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Caleb's response revealed the desperation that was beginning to infect the entire family. "Elder Meacham, perhaps there was an error in our record keeping. Our sister Patience maintains extensive files, but even the most careful record keeper can make mistakes when dealing with so